If you grew up in America, you already know how this story ends. Americans win at Midway, the tide of the Pacific War turns. Every book, every movie, every 4th of July documentary tells you the same thing. What no one ever told you is how the Japanese lost. The truth is stranger and darker and more human than any Hollywood version ever put on screen. By 10 o'clock on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the most powerful navy on Earth would cease to exist. Men who commanded it had no idea 4:30 in the morning. 1942. The Pacific is still black. Cold wind sweeps across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, and the young men in the cockpits breathe it in slowly, the way a swimmer breathes before going under. Engines cough, then roar. Blue exhaust flames flicker in the darkness like small, angry stars. Of them, above 4 Japanese carriers cutting through the sea at 25 knots, the sky is beginning to turn the color of old iron. Out there, they do not know what is waiting for them. 240 miles to the northeast, 3 American aircraft carriers have already turned their bows into the wind. Their radios are silent. Their pilots are climbing into their cockpits too. I know exactly where the Japanese fleet is. They have been waiting for days. Hours from now, 3 of these 4 Japanese carriers will be burning. Nightfall, the 4th will be burning too, and with them 3,057 men will die. Sailors, mechanics, pilots who wrote letters to their mothers last night, officers who believed until the very last second that they were the finest naval force on Earth. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, but not the one you have heard before. This is the story told through the eyes of the men who lost it, admirals who planned it, the pilots who flew it, the sailors who died in it. This is Midway from the Japanese perspective. And to understand how it went so wrong, we have to go back. Far, just 6 weeks, the spring of 1942. A quiet office in Tokyo, a 58-year-old admiral sits at his desk with his hands folded. His name is Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, most feared naval mind in the Japanese Empire. On this morning, he is more afraid than anyone in Tokyo suspects. Yamamoto is not like the other admirals. He studied at Harvard University in 1919, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He has driven across the American Midwest. He has seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Newport News, the endless wheat fields of Kansas rolling on beneath a sky no Japanese man could imagine. He remembers the auto plants in Detroit running 24 hours a day. He remembers the oil fields of Texas, burning off waste gas into a night as bright as morning. Knows a secret that the generals in Tokyo will not accept. Knows that Japan cannot win this war. 2 years earlier, in a private conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, Yamamoto had spoken with brutal honesty. "If we are ordered to do it," he said, "then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months. But I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. 6 months, that was all he promised, and now in the spring of 1942 those 6 months are almost up. Pearl Harbor strike had been brilliant, beautiful even. To ships lying on their sides in the mud, oil burning on the water. But the aircraft carriers, the ones Yamamoto had needed to destroy most of all, had not been there. Enterprise, the Lexington, they had been at sea. And now 6 months later they were still hunting his fleet across the Pacific. On the morning of April 18th, 1942, the unthinkable happened. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet, appeared in the skies over Tokyo. They dropped their bombs on schools and factories and rice fields. The damage was small, the humiliation was infinite. My emperor, the sacred emperor, had been threatened from the sky. No one had stopped it. For a nation whose entire spiritual identity rested on the idea that the home islands were untouchable, that the divine wind would always turn back the invader, this was more than an embarrassment. It was a wound to the soul. Schoolchildren looked up at the sky and asked their parents how such a thing could happen. Newspapers printed the story in tiny paragraphs buried on inside pages. But everyone knew. Yamamoto sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato and did not speak for hours. He had sworn personally to protect the skies over Tokyo. He had failed. Someone would have to answer for this. Marvel, and someone would have to make it never happen again. His answer would be called Operation Me, stood for Midway. In a tiny forgotten atoll in the middle of nowhere. 6 square miles of coral and sand 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. On the map it was almost invisible. But Yamamoto did not want the island itself. Painted what defending it would cost the Americans. Wanted the carriers. If Japan invaded Midway, the American fleet would have to come out. They would have to fight. And when they came, Yamamoto's superior force, 4 carriers strong, would trap them in the decisive battle Japanese naval doctrine had dreamed of for 40 years. Not Kantai-Kessen, the one great clash that would end the war. But there were men in Tokyo who did not agree. The naval general staff, cautious old men who had grown careful in their offices, argued for a different plan. Consolidate in the south, cut the supply lines between America and Australia. Not stretch the American Navy thin, it was slower, it was safer. It might require patience. Yamamoto listened, and then quietly he threatened to resign. Naval General Staff blinked. They knew what would happen if Yamamoto walked away. People of Japan loved him. The Emperor trusted him. There was no one else, and so they surrendered. Operation Mai was approved. The plan was enormous, almost 200 ships. Largest fleet Japan had ever assembled, a carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, an invasion fleet carrying 5,000 troops, a main body of battleships including the Yamato herself, and, on the far northern flank, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands meant to pull the Americans away from Midway before the trap could close. The operation order ran to 700 pages. It was distributed to the subordinate commanders only days before sailing. Of them barely had time to read it, and in a quiet cabin aboard the flagship, a 52-year-old officer began preparing for the war games. His name was Motome Ugaki, Rear Admiral, Chief of Staff to Yamamoto himself. And he had been ordered to simulate the coming battle, to find the weaknesses before the real thing began. War games began in early May, and almost immediately something was wrong. In the simulation, the American carriers appeared where they should not have been. They struck earlier than expected. Their dive bombers found the Japanese fleet before Japanese scouts even knew they existed. On the tabletop, Kaga was sunk. Akagi was hit. 9 bomb strikes rained down on the pride of the Imperial Navy. On the table sat a young lieutenant commander with a thin face and burning eyes. His name was Minoru Genda, 37 years old. Not the tactical genius who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack. He looked at the results, and he felt his stomach turn. "The plan is too complex," Genda said. "The carriers are too exposed." He was ignored, and then, on the tabletop, Ugaki did something extraordinary. He changed the results. He reduced the number of American hits from 9 to 3. On the Thi, he declared that Kaga, which had just been sunk in the simulation, had not really been sunk after all. She was refloated. She was ready to fight again. The war game continued as if the disaster had never happened. This is the first great turning point of our story. Because in that moment, in a stuffy room aboard a Japanese battleship, the truth was killed. Not by the enemy, by men who could not bear to see it. They called it victory disease. Senshbyo, the sickness that follows 6 months of easy conquests. Rancor, the certainty that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow. Unshakable belief that the enemy will always do what you expect him to do. The disease had already spread to the top, and it was about to get worse. Because in early May, in a stretch of ocean called the Coral Sea, 5,000 miles south of Tokyo, the battle had been fought. And what the Japanese thought had happened, and what had actually happened, were 2 very different things. The Battle of the Coral Sea lasted 3 days, May 7th through the 9th, 1942. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese counted their victories. 2 American carriers sunk, they believed. The Lexington and the Yorktown. They were half right. The Lexington had gone down, torn apart by internal explosions. but the Yorktown, by a single bomb, limped away, listing and bleeding oil into the sea. Japanese intelligence assumed she was finished. Months in dry dock at least, perhaps never to sail again. They did not know about Pearl Harbor. In Pearl Harbor's dry dock number 1, 1,400 American workers descended on the Yorktown the moment she arrived. Marked in shifts, they did not stop, they did not sleep. Boulders cut through steel, while other men stood beside them, hammering in fresh plates before the metal cooled. Rather, they tore out damaged bulkheads and replaced them with new ones fresh from the factory. In 72 hours they did what Japanese shipyards would have taken 3 months to do. Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor with paint still wet on her hull, and she headed for Midway. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, Coral Sea had cost them something they could not replace. Fleet carrier Shokaku had been hit by 3 bombs. Her flight deck was a wreck. She could not launch aircraft. She would need months of repairs in Japan. Her sister ship Zuikaku had escaped without a scratch on her hull. Her air group had been shredded. Pilots dead, planes lost. Not fight either, not without her men. 2 of Japan's finest fleet carriers, the same 2 carriers that had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, would not sail with Nagumo to Midway. Instead of 6 carriers, Yamamoto would send 4. He shrugged. 4 would be enough, he told his staff. Americans, at best, would have 2. He was wrong. They would have 3. And so, on the morning of May 27, 1942, the Great Fleet began to sail. May 27th was not chosen by accident. It was Navy Day in Japan, anniversary of Admiral Togo's crushing victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. The day every Japanese sailor was taught to remember. On the day the modern Imperial Navy was born. Now, 37 years later, that navy prepared to sail again toward what it believed would be its greatest triumph. But from Hashirajima anchorage, 4 great ships slipped their moorings. Akagi, Red Castle, Yamamoto's old command now, the flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Naga, the converted battleship, huge and slow but carrying the most aircraft of any carrier in the fleet. Hiryu, Flying Dragon, sleek and fast, and Soryu, Green Dragon, her sister ship, cutting through the water beside her. Between them, they carried 248 aircraft. Decks stood the most experienced naval aviators on Earth. 9 who had flown at Pearl Harbor, men who had bombed Darwin and Colombo and Trincomalee, and who had never known defeat. On the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood in silence. He was 55 years old, a small compact man with a face that rarely smiled. He was not a carrier admiral, not by training, not by temperament. He was a torpedo specialist. His entire career had been about surface ships, about big guns and hard steel. He had been given command of the First Air Fleet because of seniority, not because of aviation expertise. Every day that fact haunted him. Beside him stood his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, 49 years old, cautious, careful, a man who believed in doing things by the book. Nagumo spoke to him quietly, so the sailors would not hear. "Reminder, we are being asked to do too much with too little," he said. "Americans have had time to prepare, our pilots are tired, and we do not even know where their carriers are." Nothing. Nagumo continued more softly. "Otto is gambling with the fate of the Empire." Mind carried his words away. On the deck of Hiryu, another flag flew. Flag of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 50 years old. Aggressive, decisive, everything Nagumo was not. Yamaguchi believed in the attack. I believed in speed. He believed that hesitation killed more men than boldness ever would. The days ahead, when everything began to fall apart, it would be Yamaguchi who screamed for action, and it would be Nagumo who hesitated. Down in the pilot's ready room aboard Akagi, a young lieutenant studied his target maps one more time. Aim was Yoichi Tomonaga, 32 years old. Either he had been chosen to lead the first strike against Midway. The photographs he held were weeks old. They showed the airfield, fuel tanks, the defensive positions. They did not show the radar station that would detect his planes 93 miles out. show the fresh American fighters that had been flown in only days before. It did not show that the Americans were waiting. Deep in the sick bay of Akagi, another man lay very still, staring at the steel ceiling above him. His name was Mitsuo Fuchida, 39 years old. Commander, the pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, on whose aircraft had sent the code words Tora, Tora, Tora back to Tokyo and changed the world. Now, on the eve of the greatest battle of his life, he lay useless in a hospital bunk. His appendix had ruptured a few days earlier. The emergency surgery had left him too weak to walk, let alone fly. Last, at the most critical moment in Japanese naval history, Japan's most experienced strike leader would be a passenger. Of him, on the flight deck, engines were being tested. Fuel was being loaded. Bombs and torpedoes were being wheeled up from the magazines. The mechanics worked in the pre-dawn cold, their breath making small clouds in the light of the deck lamps. They believed, every one of them, that they were sailing toward another easy victory, toward another 6 months of glory. They could not have known that of the 4 carriers slicing through the dark water beneath their feet, not one would ever see Japan again. The fleet steamed east, the weather thickened. Fog began to close in around the ships, and Nagumo ordered strict radio silence. No transmissions, no signals between vessels, nothing that the Americans might intercept. I believe this was safety. It was in fact the opposite. Because at that very moment, in a stuffy basement office at Pearl Harbor, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and permanent dark circles under his eyes was reading Yamamoto's mail. The basement was not much to look at: concrete walls, cheap fluorescent lights, a few dozen desks piled high with paper, and the sour smell of coffee that had been on the burner too long. They called it the dungeon. It was the code-breaking office at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo, and the man who ran it, sitting at the largest desk in the corner, was a lieutenant commander named Joseph Rochefort, 42 years old, slight of build. He worked in a red smoking jacket and slippers because the concrete floor was cold, and he sometimes did not go home for 3 days at a stretch. His hair was thinning, his eyes were tired, and in the early months of 1942 he was doing something the Japanese Empire believed to be impossible. I was reading their mail. The Japanese naval code was called JN-25B. It was one of the most complex ciphers ever devised. It used a codebook of tens of thousands of 5-digit numbers, each representing a word or a phrase, and then those numbers were disguised again by a second layer of additive numbers drawn from another book entirely. Even with a stolen codebook, breaking it would take a lifetime. Rochefort did not have the codebook. He had never seen it. But by the spring of 1942, he and his team could read as much as a quarter of every Japanese naval message they intercepted. Enough to see the shape of what was coming. What he saw was Operation MI. He saw the massive fleet. He saw the 200-ship armada. He saw the diversion planned for the Aleutians, a target designated by the code letters A and F. He did not know what AF was. Some officers at Naval Intelligence in Washington believed AF was somewhere in the Aleutians. Others thought Hawaii itself. A few, including Rochefort, believed it was Midway. That belief was not proof. And Admiral Chester Nimitz, the 57-year-old commander of the entire Pacific Fleet, could not move his 3 precious carriers based on belief. He needed certainty, so Rochefort came up with a trick so simple it was almost embarrassing. He picked up a telephone he called the island of Midway, and he asked them to send a radio message. A message in the clear. No code. Nothing encrypted. A completely fake announcement transmitted openly that the freshwater distillation plant on Midway had broken down. The island was in trouble. That water rations would soon have to be cut. The Japanese listening posts, of course, intercepted it. I did exactly what Rochefort hoped they would do. They wrote it up, they coded it, and they transmitted it back to Tokyo in Japanese naval code, reporting that AF was suffering a water shortage. Rochefort's men decoded that message the same afternoon. They knew, Nimitz knew, he knew the target, he knew the approximate date. He knew the composition of the Japanese carrier force. Knew where Nagumo would appear. He knew when, and he began to move his own carriers silently, patiently, into a position of ambush northeast of Midway, a location the Americans called Point Luck. Nagumo steamed east through the fog, believing his radio silence protected him. Every step of his voyage had already been anticipated by a tired man in a red smoking jacket, sitting on a concrete floor in a basement 3,000 miles away. But Rochefort's triumph was only the beginning of Nagumo's blindness. Because in the days that followed, one Japanese intelligence effort after another began to fail. First was called Operation K. Operation K was supposed to be Japan's eyes over Pearl Harbor. Almost 4-engined flying boats, Kawanishi H-8Ks, were to launch from the Marshall Islands, fly nearly 2,000 miles, refuel from waiting submarines at a lonely stretch of coral called French Frigate Shoals, and then fly over Pearl Harbor at night to see with their own eyes whether the American carriers were still in port. It had worked before. In March of 1942, 2 of these flying boats had made exactly this journey. They had dropped their bombs on the mountains behind Honolulu and returned home safely. But Admiral Nimitz was a patient man, and he learned from his enemies. He remembered French Frigate Shoals, he remembered what it had been used for. Late May, he quietly sent 2 American seaplane tenders, the USS Thornton and the USS Ballard, to sit right on top of that reef. Not to patrol, to occupy, to simply be there, mining. When the Japanese submarine I-123 surfaced near the shoals to prepare for the refueling operation, her captain looked through his periscope and saw American warships anchored exactly where he needed to be. He radioed home and Operation K was cancelled. Eyes of the Empire had been closed by 2 little ships that never fired a shot. The second failure was worse. Yamamoto had ordered a picket line of submarines to stretch across the ocean between Hawaii and Midway. Our mission was simple. Watch the sea. If the American carriers came out of Pearl Harbor, spot them. Report them, track them, but the submarines were late. Their orders had been issued too tightly. Their sailing dates were behind schedule. When they finally reached their patrol stations, the American carriers had already passed through those exact waters. Enterprise and the Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Yorktown, patched and bleeding but afloat, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. All 3 were already at Point Luck, hidden in the empty ocean, waiting. Nagumo had no idea. His scouts had seen nothing. His submarines had seen nothing. His flying boats had never even launched. He was sailing into a completely empty ocean so far as he knew. And so, at 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the trap was fully set. Nagumo simply did not know he was standing inside it. Dawn came slowly. The sky went from black to grey, or pale, old blue. On the flight decks of Akagi and Kaga, engines coughed to life. On Hiryu and Soryu, the deck crews stood in their positions, arms raised, flag signals ready. 108 aircraft, 36 Aichi dive bombers, 46 Nakajima-level bombers, 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, the strike force against Midway. At their head, ready to lead them, was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. Launch was flawless. It always was. These were the finest carrier crews in the world, and they had done this hundreds of times in every kind of weather, on every ocean. The planes lifted off the decks one after another, circled the fleet in a slow, orderly formation, and turned toward the southeast, toward Midway. As the last aircraft climbed away and the horizon swallowed them, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hold back a second wave. Doctrine called for a full deck strike. Everything all at once, maximum impact, but Nagumo was cautious. He was always cautious. He kept 93 aircraft aboard his 4 carriers, armed and ready. 8 torpedo bombers carried torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons designed for one purpose: not to sink enemy ships, just in case it seemed prudent. It was, in fact, the beginning of the end. At 5 in the morning, Nagumo launched his search plane. Launched 7 aircraft to scout an ocean larger than the continental United States. Meanwhile, from Midway and from 3 American carriers, More than 30 PBY Catalina flying boats and search bombers were already in the sky, sweeping the sea in overlapping arcs. Right as the Americans wanted to see everything, Nagumo wanted only to confirm what he already believed. The sea was empty. 6 of the 7 search planes launched on time. The 7th, the one designated Tone Number 4, the one assigned to search the sector where the American fleet was actually waiting, did not launch on time. Her catapult malfunctioned. For 30 minutes, mechanics worked on the heavy cruiser Tone's Number 2 catapult while the plane sat, ready, idling, its pilots staring out at the paling sky. 60 minutes. A single mechanical delay on a single warship, one detail in an operation involving 200 ships and thousands of men. What delay would help decide the battle? At 5:34, an American PBY piloted by Lieutenant Howard Addy broke through the clouds and spotted the Japanese carriers below. Radioed a single electrifying message: enemy carriers. 19 minutes later, at 5:53, the radar station on Midway itself picked up Tomonaga's incoming strike, 93 miles out. The air raid sirens howled across the tiny atoll. Every American aircraft that could fly was scrambled. Bombers to attack the Japanese fleet, fighters to defend the island. 26 Marine fighter pilots climbed into their obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats and raced for altitude. Leading them was a Marine major named Floyd Parks. They came home. The fight above Midway lasted only minutes. The Japanese Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and their pilots had years of combat behind them. American Buffaloes were slow and lightly armed, called flying coffins by the men who had to fly them. Actually, 13 of the 26 American fighters were shot down. Far more were so badly damaged they never flew again. Major Parks was among the dead. The Japanese lost only 2 aircraft. Seat T. Tomonaga's strike arrived over Midway. Iden, the Japanese pilots bombed with the precision they had shown at Pearl Harbor. All tanks exploded. The seaplane hangar collapsed. Many buildings burned. Craters opened across the runway. But when Tomonaga circled to assess the damage, he saw something that made his stomach turn cold. American aircraft were still taking off. The runway was cratered but functional. And more importantly, not a single American plane had been caught on the ground. They had all launched before the strike arrived. Somehow, impossibly, the Americans had known he was coming. At 7 in the morning, Tomonaga sent a radio message back to Nagumo. For a second attack wave. The message reached the bridge of Akagi at almost the same moment as something else. Something no one had expected. The Americans were attacking back. 6 torpedo bombers appeared low over the water. TBF Avengers, brand new on their first combat mission. Behind them came 4 Army B-26 medium bombers, hastily fitted with torpedoes. No fighter escort. They flew straight into the Japanese combat air patrol. The Zeros tore them apart. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down. Of the B-26s went in flames. No hits were scored. But one of the surviving B-26s, a bomber flown by a young lieutenant named James Murray, did something that no one on Akagi's bridge would ever forget. He dropped his torpedo. It missed, and then, instead of turning away, Murray pulled up and flew directly at the aircraft carrier, on the length of her flight deck, not 50 feet above the wooden planks. His gunners hammered away with their machine guns as they passed. Not 2 Japanese sailors on the deck were killed instantly. The aircraft pulled up at the last possible second, roaring over the bridge itself, so close that Nagumo and his staff officers ducked below the railings. Second B-26, this one piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mize, came in behind Murray. His aircraft was in flames. He never leveled off. His bomber crashed into the sea just off Akagi's starboard bow. Later, historians would debate whether Myers had lost control or whether he had tried to ram the ship. One who watched him die never knew for sure. On the bridge, Nagumo pulled himself back up to his feet. His hands were shaking. He was 55 years old, a torpedo specialist, a careful man, and an enemy aircraft had just flown down his own flight deck. War God, one of his staff officers would later write, had given us a warning. Nagumo did not hear the warning. He heard only Tomonaga's request for a second strike. At 7:15 in the morning he made his decision. He ordered his 93 reserve aircraft to be rearmed. The torpedoes and the armor-piercing bombs, the weapons that had been carefully loaded for anti-ship attack, were to be removed. On their place, general-purpose land bombs would be loaded. Bombs designed to hit fuel dumps and runways and hangars. To finish the job at Midway, the order was in direct violation of Yamamoto's instructions. Otto had specifically ordered that a reserve be kept ready for ships. But Nagumo believed, as he had every reason to believe, that there were no American ships within 1,000 miles. On the flight deck, in the vast enclosed hangars of 4 aircraft carriers, chaos began. Torpedoes weigh nearly a ton apiece. Bombs weigh half that. To remove them from an aircraft, you have to lower the plane on a hydraulic elevator, wheel it into position, unclamp the ordnance, and use a hoist to lift it away. Then you have to bring up new ordnance from the magazines deep below decks. Wheel that into position, pump it into place, and reset the release mechanisms. It is precise, dangerous work. It takes time, and there was no time. Doctrine required that torpedoes and bombs, once removed, be lowered back into the armored magazines below the waterline. Deep safe, locked away, the ordnance crews did not do that. There was no time. They stacked the torpedoes against the hangar bulkheads. They piled the bombs on the deck between aircraft. They rolled fueling hoses across the floor, snaking them between engines that were being warmed up. Hangars, all 4 of them, became rooms full of gasoline and high explosives, sitting in the open. If one of the mechanics could have spoken freely, he might have said what everyone was thinking. Hangar deck looked like a bomb factory. One spark and we all die. At 7:28, the radio room aboard Akagi received a new signal. It was from Tone Number 4, the scout plane that had launched 30 minutes late. She had reached the end of her outbound leg, and she had seen something. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Bearing 0, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150. Speed over 20 knots. Nagumo read the message twice. Grabbed the microphone himself. Ascertain ship types. There was no immediate reply. The minutes crawled by. Down below in the hangars, the ordnance crews continued their frantic work. Torpedoes came off. Bombs went on. The hangars filled with the smell of oil and hot metal. Nobody stopped them. Nobody could. For 12 minutes the reply did not come. Minutes. Nagumo did not know whether he was facing cruisers or carriers. He did not know whether to keep rearming for a land attack or to reverse everything and prepare for a fleet battle. For 12 minutes he stood on the bridge in a silence that grew heavier with every second. At 8:09 the reply arrived. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo exhaled. Only cruisers, only destroyers, no carriers. He turned to Kusaka and gave a small tight nod. The rearming for land attack would continue. All was well. 11 minutes later, at 8:20, another message from Tone Number 4 shattered his composure. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. Nagumo froze. Cross the fleet on the bridge of Hiryu. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi Sosei-seim. Freeze. He acted within 10 minutes. At 8:30 he had a signal flag hoisted from his flagship. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi understood. In that moment, everything that Nagumo would take another hour to understand. He knew there were carriers out there. He knew that every minute of delay meant more American aircraft would appear over the Japanese fleet. He knew that a partial strike, launched now, was better than a perfect strike, launched too late. That's right. Nagumo hesitated. His decks were in chaos. Half the aircraft had been rearmed for land attack. The other half were being torn apart in the middle of the switch. The Zeras that had been flying combat air patrol were running low on fuel. Tomonaga's returning strike from Midway was approaching, and those aircraft would need to be recovered soon, or they would fall into the sea. Launch an immediate attack, Yamaguchi urged. That would mean sending a small, uncoordinated force without fighter escort against an unknown enemy. Kosaka pulled Nagumo aside. "If we launch piecemeal, we lose everything for nothing," he said. "Better to recover our aircraft, rem properly, then strike as one." Gender, sick and pale, but on the bridge, disagreed. "Speed is everything now, launch what we have." Nagumo made his choice. He sided with Kusaka. He would recover Tomonaga's force. He would rearm properly, and then he would strike with full strength. He sent a signal to all 4 carriers. "After completing recovery of aircraft, we shall proceed north to engage the enemy." And so at that very moment, aboard all 4 Japanese carriers, the rearming order went out. "On bombs off. Put the torpedoes back on. Reverse everything you have just done." The ordnance crews stared at each other. Some of them cursed openly, which was not something Japanese sailors did in front of officers. They began the work again. The stacked torpedoes were rolled back to the aircraft. Bombs were pulled and piled, in some cases directly next to the torpedoes they had just replaced. Hose of fueling ran everywhere, aircraft engines idled. Hangars, already dangerous, became worse than dangerous. Above, on the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo issued his final orders. Tomonaga's strike was recovered, starting at 8:37 in the morning. The aircraft that landed was struck below, refueled, rearmed. Elevators cycled up and down, carrying planes into the hangar deck below. Nobody looked up. Nobody noticed the specks on the horizon. London, the Americans had been searching for hours. They had been launching wave after wave of aircraft from 3 different carriers from every deck they had. And they were finally arriving. At 9:20 in the morning, 15 American torpedo bombers appeared low over the water, coming in from the south. They were TBD devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8, based on the USS Hornet. Their commander was a lieutenant commander named John Waldron. He was 41 years old, of Sioux heritage, deeply religious. He had led his men in a prayer before takeoff, also told them a letter he wrote the night before, that if his plane went down, they should keep pressing the attack, even if only 1 man was left alive. Believed his squadron was flying to its death. He was right. The Devastator was already obsolete when Waldron flew it into battle. Its top speed was around 100 knots. Its torpedoes, notorious Mark 13, on shallow, on slow, and often failed to explode. To attack a moving warship, a Devastator had to fly low over the water at 100 knots in a straight line for the last 2 minutes of the run. Waldron's squadron had no fighter escort. They came in alone. The Japanese Zeros on combat air patrol, more than 30 of them, saw the low-flying American torpedo planes and dove on them like hawks on pigeons. The battle lasted perhaps 10 minutes. One by one, the Devastators were shot out of the sky. One by one, 15 aircraft, 30 men. Every single Devastator was destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. Of the 30 American airmen who flew into that attack, only 1 survived. His name was Ensign George Gay. He was 25 years old. His plane was hit repeatedly on the run-in. His gunner in the rear seat was killed. His plane crashed into the sea. Gay pulled himself out of the sinking wreckage, inflated his life vest, and grabbed a black rubber seat cushion from the floating debris. He hid under it because he did not want the Japanese to see him and machine gun him in the water. Under that cushion, for the next several hours, George Gay watched the entire Battle of Midway unfold with his own eyes. 9:54, 14 more Devastators appeared. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. He was 46 years old, an experienced pilot, and he had been badly injured in a landing crash only a week earlier. He insisted on flying anyway. 10 of his 14 aircraft were shot down. Lindsay was killed. 4 Devastators escaped, no hits. At 10:12, 12 more Devastators arrived. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 10 of his 12 aircraft were shot down. Massey was killed. 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked. 35 had been shot down. 1 torpedo had found its target. On the bridge of Akagi there was cheering. The Zeros were victorious. The great American attack, if it could be called that, had been shattered. Nagumo ordered his strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30. Victory, actual victory, it felt within his grasp, but high above the Japanese fleet, so high that no one on the bridge could see them. Two groups of American dive bombers were arriving. The first group came from the USS Enterprise. 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers led by a lieutenant commander named Wade McCluskey. McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for hours. Navigation had been correct, his fleets had been wrong. He had reached the point where his fuel gauges warned him to turn back. But he was flying blind over an empty sea with nothing beneath him but blue water in every direction. And then he saw something. Far below him, 19,000 feet down, a single Japanese destroyer was cutting through the water at flank speed. She was leaving a long white wake behind her, arrow straight, pointing north. The destroyer was the Arashi. She had been depth charging an American submarine, the USS Nautilus, and now she was hurrying to rejoin her fleet. Her captain had no idea that far above him, an American dive bomber commander was watching him. McCluskey did what any good hunter does. He followed the arrow. North, he turned his squadrons and flew along the destroyer's wake, north into the empty sea. At the same moment, from an entirely different direction, 17 more Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Yorktown were approaching. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. Through pure accident, through pure coincidence, both squadrons arrived over the Japanese fleet at exactly the same time. They arrived at 10:20 in the morning. Every Japanese Zero was still down at sea level, hunting the last of the torpedo bombers. Not one fighter was above 10,000 feet. Not one. McCluskey's dive bombers rolled over first. Then Leslie, 50 American aircraft all at once, plunging from 14,000 feet toward the rising sun insignias painted on the wooden flight decks below. On Akagi, a lookout finally saw them. He screamed the warning that would echo through Japanese naval history for the next 80 years. All divers. But it was too late. The Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible moment. Their fighters were at sea level. Their decks were being spotted for launch. Their hangars, all 4 of them, were packed with fueled and armed aircraft, and stacked to the ceiling with the loose torpedoes and bombs left over from 2 frantic rearming reversals. There is a great deal of nonsense written about this, a beautiful old myth that says the Japanese aircraft were on their flight decks, engines running, ready to launch. That is not what happened. The Japanese aircraft were still down below in the hangars being rearmed. But it did not matter. The bombs were coming. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed over into his dive against the carrier Kaga. 1,000-pound bombs struck her flight deck within seconds of each other. The first exploded near her bridge, killing her captain, Okada, almost every officer on the command tower. Second and third bombs punched through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar below among aircraft that were being fueled. Fourth bomb finished the job. Within moments, aviation gasoline was spraying across the hangar deck, ignited by the fires, and the loose bombs began to cook off in secondary explosions that no damage control party in the world could have stopped. Kaga was a torch within 2 minutes. 2 miles away, Lieutenant Richard Best of the USS Enterprise led his 3-plane element in a dive against Akagi. Only one of the 3 bombs actually hit. Just one. A single 1,000-pound bomb, dropped by Best himself, struck the aft edge of Akagi's flight deck elevator and exploded in the upper hangar deck. That single bomb detonated the loose torpedoes and bombs that had been stacked there in the rearming chaos. Within 2 minutes, the temperature in Akagi's hangar exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Who tried to reach the fires were burned alive before they could turn a valve. One bomb. That was all it took, one bomb, and the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy became a floating crematorium. At the same instant, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers plunged onto the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits. The first 2 struck her flight deck. A third exploded in her forward hangar, fuel lines burst. Ammunition detonated, Soryu, like her sisters, became an inferno. Her captain, Ryusaku Yamamoto, refused to leave his bridge. Was 48 years old, a career officer. a man who believed in the old code. According to Petty Officer Abe's later testimony, when Abe was sent to bring the captain off the burning ship, Nagumo stood in front of him, drew his ceremonial sword, and began to sing the Japanese national anthem. Igo, may your reign last 1,000 generations. Iob backed away weeping. His captain was still singing when the flames took the bridge. By 10:28 in the morning, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers were burning uncontrollably. 6 minutes. 6 minutes to destroy 3/4 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's strike power. 6 minutes that would decide the outcome of a war. The battle was not yet over. Because miles to the north, hidden behind a squall line, 4th carrier Hiryu had been touched. On her bridge stood a man who was already planning his revenge. Yamaguchi did not weep. He did not curse. He looked at the smoke rising from 3 burning ships on the horizon, and he began giving orders. Get every serviceable aircraft into the sky. Find the American carriers. Attack. At 10:58, Hiryu launched her counterstrike. 19 Aichi Valdive bombers, 6 Zero fighter escorts, 24 aircraft, all that remained of Japan's carrier air power in the Pacific. Commander was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. He was 29 years old. He knew this might be his last flight. He followed the returning American aircraft home. On their carrier just before noon, he put 3 bombs into the USS Yorktown. He was shot down over her burning deck. For 2 hours, American damage control parties worked miracles. They put out the fires. They restored electrical power. By early afternoon, Yorktown was making 20 knots again, and her radar was scanning the sky. Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 1:31 in the afternoon. Only 10 aircraft left, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. Leading them in the pilot's seat of the lead Kate was Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga. Tomonaga's aircraft had been damaged in the morning's strike against Midway. His left-wing fuel tank had been holed by anti-aircraft fire. Mechanics had time to fill only his right tank. He had enough fuel to fly out to the American carriers. He did not have enough fuel to fly back. They offered him another airplane. He refused. Every aircraft is needed, he said quietly, and he climbed into his own. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Kaga found the Yorktown, still making 19 knots, all fighting. American Wildcats tore into his formation. His own Kate caught fire. Trailing black smoke, one wing burning, he held his course. Hauled it until the very last possible second. Or then, still burning, on target, he dropped his torpedo. Torpedoes hit Yorktown that afternoon. One of them was Tomonaga's. Last act, before his burning aircraft plunged into the sea, was to hit the ship he had come to kill. Yorktown listed 26 degrees to port. Her power went out. Fires burned out of control. She would never fight again. Tomonaga was gone, and so was the last hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood alone. 3 of his sister ships were burning on the horizon, distant pillars of black smoke rising into the evening sky like funeral candles. His own carrier had launched 2 counterstrikes and crippled an American carrier in return. He had done everything a man could do. It was not enough. At 5:02 in the afternoon, the lookouts on Hiryu began screaming again. 24 American Dauntless dive bombers, launched from the Enterprise, had found the last Japanese carrier. They pushed over into their dives from 14,000 feet. Gucci's remaining Zeros climbed to meet them, but there were too few. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. Her forward elevator was blown into the air and thrown against the bridge, twisted and smoking. Her hangar deck erupted in flames. By 6 in the evening, Hiryu was dying. Gucci did not order abandon ship. Not yet. He walked from the bridge down to the flight deck where his crew was already assembling. Hundreds of young men, sailors with soot-black faces, mechanics with burned hands, pilots who had flown that morning and had no aircraft left to fly. He climbed onto an ammunition crate so they could see him. He apologized. He told them the defeat was his responsibility. Told them to survive. He told them that Japan would rebuild her navy stronger than before, and that they, the men standing in front of him, would be the ones to do it. Honor. Then he turned to Captain Tomeo Kaku, the 49-year-old commander of the Hiryu, and he said what both men had already decided. Nodded. We will remain. There was no argument. There was no debate. Both men walked back to the bridge, sat down in their command chairs and waited. Somewhere in Japan, their families were setting the table for supper. Night of June 4th into the morning of June 5th, the Imperial Japanese Navy died in slow motion. Soryu went first. She had been burning for nearly 9 hours. At 7:13 in the evening, she rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. 711 of her sailors went with her. Kaga followed 12 minutes later, 811 dead. Our captain had already been killed on the bridge. Akagi, the flagship, refused to die. She burned all through the night. Every time the damage control parties thought they were gaining ground, another explosion tore through her guts. By dawn on June 5th, she was still afloat, but nothing could save her. At 4:50 in the morning, Japanese destroyers moved into position around their own flagship and fired 4 torpedoes into her side. She sank a few minutes later, taking 267 more sailors down with her. Hiryu was the last. She was scuttled by her own escorts at 5:10 in the morning on June 5th. 392 men went with her. Yamaguchi and Kaku were on her bridge as she rolled over. Our bodies were never found. At 2 in the morning on that same June 5th, 600 miles away aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto finally accepted what could not be denied any longer. He walked to the radio room himself. He wrote out the message in his own hand. He gave it to the signals officer. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. Off drawer. Then he walked back to his cabin and closed the door. His staff would not see him for 3 days. But the disaster was not yet complete. 200 miles away, the crippled American carrier Yorktown was being towed slowly back toward Pearl Harbor. Was still afloat. Her damage control parties had performed miracles. But if she could be brought home, she might sail again. But she had one enemy left, and he was already hunting her. His name was Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, 37 years old, the captain of the Japanese submarine I-168. He had spent the previous day off Midway, providing weather reports to Yamamoto's fleet, watching the American attacks through his periscope. He had seen Kaga burning. He had seen the smoke rising from Akagi and Soryu. And he had made himself a promise he would not go home empty-handed. Abe stalked the Yorktown for hours. She was surrounded by 7 destroyers, a nearly impassable screen. Tanabe was patient. He was invisible. He crept in at 3 knots, so slowly that his own periscope barely made a wake. He slipped through the destroyer screen. He slipped past their sonar. And 31 in the afternoon on June 6th, from a range of 1,200 yards, he fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 hit the Yorktown, 1 hit the destroyer USS Hammond, tied up alongside her providing power for her pumps. Hammond broke in half. She sank in 4 minutes. Own depth charges, 9 which should have been safed, went off underwater as she went down, killing many of the sailors who had jumped into the sea to save themselves. 80 American sailors died with her. The Yorktown hit twice more, listed further. Our crew was taken off. She stayed afloat all through the night. At 7:01 on the morning of June 7th, 1942, she rolled onto her side and sank in more than 16,000 feet of water. 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Mikuma and the Mogami, had been sent to bombard Midway on the night of the disaster. In the darkness, trying to avoid an American submarine attack, they collided with each other at nearly full speed. Both were damaged. Both fell behind the retreat. On June 6th, American dive bombers found Kuma was hit again and again. She went down with 700 of her crew, the largest loss of life on any single ship at Midway. Ogami, gutted and burning, limped back to base with 92 dead. It was over. The fleet turned home and the silence began. Wounded sailors and pilots were taken below to isolated compartments. They were forbidden to speak. Their radios were removed. Their letters home were seized, guards were posted at their hatches. When food was brought to them, no one spoke to them. When they needed medical care, doctors came in silence. On June 14, 1942, the surviving ships of Yamamoto's fleet returned to Hashirajima Naval Base. They anchored at night in the dark to avoid being seen. Wounded were carried off in stretchers, moving through blackout, loaded into unmarked trucks. They were driven to naval hospitals that had been secretly emptied of all other patients. Their files were stamped secret patients. Their names were removed from official records. Are placed in isolated wards. Guards stood at the doors. No visitors were allowed, not friends, not officers, not families, not mothers, not wives. The survivors of the air groups were reassigned that same week to distant bases in the Solomon Islands, thousands of miles away, before they could speak to anyone. Most of them would die there over the next year, killed in the meat grinder battles for Guadalcanal, where the elite pilots of the Japanese Navy were slowly, methodically exterminated. The dead of Midway were in a sense the lucky ones. Either they had died quickly, the living had to survive their own government's shame. Tokyo, the propaganda machine, was already running. On the evening of June 5th, while Akagi was still burning, while Hiryu was slipping beneath the waves, while Yamaguchi was already dead, Tokyo Radio broadcast the news to the Japanese people. Naval and air forces of the Empire have succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added more detail. A great victory had been won. 2 American carriers had been sunk. Enemy losses were catastrophic. Japanese losses were mentioned almost as an afterthought. One carrier, the Kaga, had been damaged, the Soryu had been lost. Nothing was said about Akagi. Nothing was said about Hiryu. Our sinkings would not be publicly admitted until after the war ended, 3 years later. The Japanese people celebrated in the streets. They hung banners from their windows. They cheered a catastrophe. The lie went even deeper. The Imperial Japanese Army was not informed of what had really happened for a full month. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the most powerful man in the country, was kept in the dark about the true extent of the disaster. Not a single admiral was court-martialed, not one was reprimanded. To punish anyone would have been to admit that anything had gone wrong. On paper, Akagi and Hiryu continued to exist. Their names remained on the active fleet roster. Their crews were officially still assigned to them. Ships that were rusting at the bottom of the Pacific were listed for the next year as being in port for maintenance. The truth was more than the Empire could bear to speak. On the battleship Yamato, on the long silent voyage home, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone in his cabin. His staff heard him pacing at night. They heard him talking to himself. Not go in. To a small circle of officers he trusted. In a private meeting later recorded in the post-war diary of his chief planner, Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto reportedly spoke with a bluntness that no propaganda broadcast would ever match. "I gambled and lost," he said. "In trying to destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own. War is not lost yet, but I fear I have lost the means to win it." Numbers proved him right. 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen had died in the space of 2 days. 267 on Akagi, 811 on Kaga, 392 on Hiryu, 711 on Soryu, 100 more on the cruiser Mikuma, 92 on Mogami. But the ships and the sailors were not in the end the worst of the losses. Japan could build more ships, she could conscript more sailors. She could not replace what else had been lost. Only about 110 of the dead were pilots. Number, small as it seems, was still catastrophic because each of those pilots had spent years in the finest naval flight school in the world. Our skills could not be quickly reproduced. But the truly irreplaceable losses were the 700 experienced aircraft mechanics, ordnance men, and flight deck crews who had died in the fires below decks. These were the men who knew every rivet of a Zero fighter, could rebuild an engine by feel in the dark, who could arm a torpedo in fog with cold, wet hands. Our expertise had taken decades to develop, one shipboard apprenticeship at a time. not be replaced in a year. It could not be replaced in 2 years. Not, as it turned out, be replaced at all. Chief of Staff Ugaki wrote in his diary, later captured by American forces and translated after the war, a line that summed it up. We can build new carriers in 2 years. We cannot build new pilots with the experience of those we lost. And we will never replace the skilled maintenance crews who knew how to keep our aircraft flying under combat conditions. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. Never. 2 years later, in June of 1944, in the waters off the Mariana Islands, the Japanese Navy would send its rebuilt carrier force into battle one last time. Our pilots had trained for only a few months. Their aircraft were now inferior to the American Hellcats. Their ships were fine, but the men were green. The Americans called what happened next the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, over 600 Japanese aircraft were shot down. All squadrons died without scoring a single hit. The pilots who had been children when their fathers died at Midway were now dying themselves for the same emperor in the same ocean without any of their fathers' skill. The seeds of that slaughter had been planted in the burning hangars of Kaga and Akagi. Men who had planned Midway paid their own prices in their own ways. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was quietly removed from carrier command. His career was over, though no one would say so aloud. He was shuffled to shore assignments, then to a garrison command on the island of Saipan. In July of 1944, American Marines landed on Saipan and drove the Japanese defenders into the northern hills. Nagumo did not surrender. In a small cave near the sea at the age of 57, he took a pistol and shot himself. His body was not recovered until after the war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not survive to see the empire he had feared for fall. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that had triggered his Midway obsession, American codebreakers intercepted his flight schedule. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters, flying at the extreme edge of their fuel range, ambushed his transport plane over the jungle of Bougainville. His aircraft crashed into the trees. Japanese search parties finally found him. He was still strapped into his seat, his ceremonial sword upright in his gloved hand, his eyes staring calmly at the sky. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku were both promoted posthumously to higher rank. Bodies remain, last day, somewhere in the wreckage of the Hiryu, up 17,000 feet down. Commander Minoru Genda survived the war. He went on, in peacetime, to become a general in Japan's post-war defense forces, a member of parliament, and one of the architects of modern Japanese aviation. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida survived too. He was badly burned when Akagi was abandoned, and he broke both ankles jumping from the burning bridge onto the flight deck during the evacuation. After the war, disillusioned and haunted, he converted to Christianity and became a traveling evangelist. He preached reconciliation between Japan and America until his death in 1976. Some of what he wrote about Midway in his later memoirs has been questioned by modern historians. Some of it is almost certainly wrong. But the truth of his own journey, from the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor to a preacher of peace, mirrored the journey of his entire country. Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest in over 17,000 feet of black, cold, silent water. Their exact positions have been mapped by deep-sea expeditions, most famously by the explorer Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic. On the ocean floor, in eternal darkness, they lie undisturbed. Their aircraft still sit in the hangar bays where they were being rearmed. The bones of their crews remain at their battle stations. They are war graves now, nothing more. There is a myth about Midway that says the battle was decided in 5 minutes. It is a beautiful line. It is not quite true. The dive bombers began their attack at 10:22 in the morning. Last bomb hit at about 10:28, 6 minutes. 5. And the myth misses the deeper truth. The Battle of Midway was not decided in 6 minutes on June 4th. It was decided weeks earlier. It was decided in a stuffy basement in Pearl Harbor, where a tired man in a red smoking jacket broke a code he was not supposed to be able to break. Either it was decided in a wargaming room in Tokyo where a chief of staff changed the rules because the truth was too painful to face. Mining. It was decided in a hangar deck where torpedoes were stacked against bulkheads because there was no time to lower them safely. It was decided by pride, by certainty, by the calm, unquestioned assumption that the enemy would always do what you expected him to do. Iron. The 3,000 young men who died at Midway believed they were fighting for their emperor, for their families, for an empire that would last 1,000 years. Either they could not have known that they were actually dying for something else. A lesson that every powerful nation, every powerful company, every powerful institution, every century must eventually learn. No fleet is unsinkable, that no plan is perfect. Not the greatest enemy any strong man ever faces is not the one across the ocean. It is the one in his own mirror. The waves close over Midway now. They have closed over it for 84 years. Somewhere down there, in water so deep that no sunlight has ever touched it, 4 Japanese carriers lie in the dark, tilted at their final angles, their rusted decks still pointing east. Toward the enemy they never saw, toward the future they helped to make. Toward a Japan that would rise again, in a different way, and become one of the great peaceful nations of the earth, built by the sons and grandsons of the boys who never came home from Midway. They died believing they were losing a battle. In truth, they were losing a war. Unwinning, without ever knowing it, the long, slow peace that came after,